Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Fawn Manor. And it's my 10 favorite authors of all time. I'm kind of surprised I haven't done this list. I realized yesterday that I've never done this before, and it seems like the kind of dopey video I'd do, so here I am doing it. My 10 favorite authors. None of them are a surprise if you watch this channel, but here they are all anyway. Now, none of these, I'm not claiming that any of these writers are the greatest writers in the world. It'll become apparent pretty quick that they're not. These are just my favorites. They're just my favorite writers. They're the writers that appeal to me the most, and they are my favorites, not the best writers in the world. I'm aware. I'm also aware that my 10 favorite writers all happen to be dead white guys. There's nothing nefarious about this. It just happens. It just happened that way. I will probably get in trouble in the comments, but if you can't be honest, what's the point of doing this kind of list? So here they are, my 10 favorite writers of all time. Number 10, Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, which that would put him on this list automatically anyway, because I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan and I love the Sherlock Holmes stories and novels. But Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a lot more than that. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a lot of historical fiction, a lot of adventure fiction, horror fiction, other mysteries that had nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. Science fiction, he wrote a lot. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. All of it, or just about all of it, is in the public domain now. So you can find all of this stuff if you've got a Kindle or an e-reader. You can find all of this stuff pretty easily and cheaply. Unfortunately, in print, a lot of his work that isn't Sherlock Holmes can be hard to find. But you can read it. You can read it all if you've got an e-reader. And I highly recommend Arthur Conan Doyle. He's a really good writer. He knows how to tell a story, this guy. So yeah, that's number 10. Moving on to number 9, Arthur Mackin. Arthur Mackin. This is a writer I like an awful lot, Arthur Mackin. Dark, spooky, sometimes disturbing writer, Arthur Mackin. One of the more important Welsh writers. He was an important Welsh writer and very influential writer of horror fiction. His story, The Great God Pan, has been anthologized to death. A lot of his fiction has. He wrote an episodic novel called The Three Impostors, and different portions of that novel have been published as individual short stories. But I would look up Arthur Mackin if you've not read his stuff before. It's good stuff. And I really like Arthur Mackin and his work. He didn't write a lot of fiction, but yeah, what he did write was really, really good for the most part. Not everything was great, but he wrote a lot of good stuff. So yeah, Arthur Mackin, which brings me to number 8, Ross McDonald. Ross McDonald, detective writer Ross McDonald. He wrote the Lou Archer series of detective novels, excellent detective novels, which more than just about the mystery, they're about the people in the novels, about the dark secrets people can hide, about the dark secrets that families can keep. They're good books. They're excellent detective novels. His earlier stuff was kind of comparable to Chandler in a way, but he went in his own direction pretty early on. And the Lou Archer series is great. I highly recommend those. I really, really like Ross McDonald. A lot of his best stuff is in the Library of America now, so I'm not the only person that likes Ross McDonald. He is highly regarded. Which brings me to another detective writer. For number 7, Daschle Hammett. Daschle Hammett, the author of The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man and The Glass Key. And he's another writer that didn't write a lot. He wrote a few books and that was it. Then he was done. But those books were excellent. He also did a series of short stories about a character, the Continental Op, where he was able to put a lot of his own experiences. He was a private detective for the Pinkerton Agency for a while. And so he knew his business and he knew about being a detective. And so he did put a lot of his own experience into his work. And he put a lot of what he felt were kind of characters speaking the way people speak in the real world. It wasn't as stylized or as false as some of the dialogue you'd get in some of the other books that were written at the time. He tried to throw some real life in there in his work. Excellent stuff. Of course, The Maltese Falcon is a legendary piece of mystery fiction and detective fiction. Yeah. Daschle Hammett. He's fantastic. So, that brings us to a different writer. At number 6, Richard Matheson. Of course it's Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson, the author of I Am Legend and The Shrinking Man, 2 fantastic science fiction horror novels. They're both science fiction and they're both horror. He also wrote several screenplays for The Twilight Zone. He also wrote a lot of screenplays for television movies and things like that. He wrote quite a few novels aside from those I mentioned. He wrote Hell House. He wrote quite a bit, Richard Matheson did. And most of his stuff was pretty good. Really good as far as his short stories and his major novels are concerned. Highly recommend Richard Matheson. He was a major influence on Stephen King and a bunch of other writers. So yeah, Richard Matheson, of course. Which brings me to number 5, H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, who wrote a series of early science fiction novels. The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, In the Days of the Comet, First Men in the Moon. I mean, he wrote a lot of really excellent and really influential stuff. And then he moved on and he wrote some different kinds of things. His social novels, a lot of those I have not read yet, but some I have. He always assumed, I think, that that was his important work, that that would be the work that would last. But no, it was his early science fiction work that has made his name and has lasted. And they are kind of timeless, and I think that's why they have lasted in a way that his social novels have not. Although a lot of his stuff is still in print. Penguin has a really nice line of H.G. Wells. And again, he's another author who wrote a ton, and you can get just about all of it on your e-reader for very, very cheap. So, yeah, H.G. Wells. He was fantastic. Which brings us to number 4, Raymond Chandler. Another detective story writer, Raymond Chandler. A really, really, really good one. One of the most influential series of detective novels were the Philip Marlowe novels, which he wrote. He also wrote some short stories featuring that character. Earlier on, the character was known as Mallory, I believe. His early detective was Mallory, but he was transformed into Marlowe by the time he started writing his novels with The Big Sleep and his other great novels, The Lady in the Lake and some others. Great writer, Raymond Chandler. His books are fantastic. Again, you can find him in the Library of America. Great set. There's a 2-volume set of his work in the Library of America. He did work in Hollywood as well. He did the screenplay for Double Indemnity. Yeah, Raymond Chandler. He was awesome. So yeah, of course, Raymond Chandler, which brings me to number 3. Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs. Probably no one's idea of the world's greatest writer, of course, but he was fun, this guy. He was the master of adventure. Now, some of his stuff could be pretty far-fetched, but that's okay. While you read it, you believed it, for the most part. He wrote Tarzan of the Apes. He wrote the Tarzan series of novels. He wrote the John Carter of Mars series of novels, also known as the Barsoom series. He wrote novels set on Venus. He wrote novels set in the middle of the Earth, in the inner world of Pellucidar, which started with his novel At the Earth's Core. He wrote a lot of books, and they were all filled with adventure, fun adventure. This is another writer who was really influential, actually. He never took himself too seriously, but I love his work. I'm a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Not all of his work has held up so well today. Some of the depictions in his work of African natives and some other people, they're not always great. They're not always bad, but they're not always great. He was certainly a man of his time, that's for sure, but I love him. I love his work. So Edgar Rice Burroughs. Which brings me to number 2. H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, of course. Probably the most important horror writer of the 20th century. He was completely unique. He had a way of writing all his own. Now, his style, well, people criticize his style all the time, although I feel that he was the master of his style. He used his style, his style of writing, to produce an effect of horror. Even though a lot of what he wrote, actually, particularly in his later years, was actually science fiction. And he was also a writer who changed a lot through the years. His early fiction reads much differently than his later fiction does. The fiction that he did in his last few years was magnificent. He is an author with some, well, there are things we can criticize about this guy, and we all know what they are. But any personal failings he might have had, I wouldn't carry over to his writing. His writing was important. And indeed, a lot of his xenophobia and prejudices, he actually put a lot of that fear, the fear of everybody else who was different than him, he put a lot of that into his horror, which made it pretty effective. And I love his work, H.P. Lovecraft. It was something. And if you read all of his stuff together, it kind of makes up this epic world of horror. It's something else. So yeah, H.P. Lovecraft, which brings me to number 1, which should be no surprise because I mentioned that this guy is my favorite writer all the time. That is, of course, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Bran Mak Morn, King Kull, Solomon Kane, and so many others. Robert E. Howard was the greatest pulp writer to ever live. He was a magnificent pulp writer. His Conan stories were just amazing. Because his best work, it was more than just adventure fiction, which he was excellent at. Adventure fiction with a dark, supernatural edge to it. A lot of monsters running around in Robert E. Howard's stories. He was a friend and correspondent of H.P. Lovecraft, and they shared a lot of ideas in their work. So even though they were completely different writers, you will find some Lovecrafty type of things in Robert E. Howard's stuff. But the reason his work stands out so much, as H.P. Lovecraft pointed out after Robert E. Howard's death, is that Robert E. Howard put himself into everything he did. He couldn't help it. That's just the way he was. And this elevated all of his work to another level. A lot of what he put into his work was his own worldview, his own feelings about life. Very often, the source of this was misery and loneliness. And so there's a lot of darkness in his work, which actually helps make it as great as it is. It's more than just sword and sorcery fantasy fiction because of that, because he put so much of himself in his stories. He sort of lived his stories as he wrote them, which is great because when you read one of his stories, it's like you're experiencing the story more than you're reading it. I can go on and on about this guy. He is my favorite, Robert E. Howard. So there you go. It's my 10 favorite writers. Like I said, not a lot of surprises on this list, but I felt like I ought to do it. So there it is, my 10 favorites. Catch me tomorrow when I've got something entirely different. And later on this week, I should have the Robert E. Howard Show, actually, probably on Thursday, I'm hoping. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.